Okay, good morning. It's time to start. Glad to see you're here. We're going to continue our class on Proverbs. If you have the book that we've been using, we're on lesson 10 this morning. And I'll say ahead of time, I put in new contacts this morning and I can't see at all. They're really bad. I'm going to squint more than usual. So I may have people called on to read for me this morning. I can't read my own notes. But anyway, so we've been moving quickly through the book of Proverbs, and that's the case again today, that we're going to be covering a lot of ground. There's chapters 17, 18, and 19 all today. But just looking at, from the book, the verse that they suggest that we memorize and meditate is from Proverbs chapter 18, 24. A man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there is a friend who sticks closer to a brother. And some of the other translations render that a little bit differently, but that's the one that's from the book, Proverbs 18:24. Where we are in the class as we move through the summer, if today, August 4, and of course lesson 10, and then we'll move on this evening and do lesson 11, which is another 4 chapters. So, all right, here's our Proverbs illustrated from the mind of a child. This is Proverbs 18, verse 9. A person who does not work hard is just like a person who destroys things. So illustrated there, somebody cruelly destroying something, and you probably can't tell that, but there's a guy inside that house looking through the door asking for help. Okay, but the memorize and meditate verse from this morning is really going to be kind of set the tone for what we're going to talk about today. And if you'll recall from that verse, there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And so what we're going to be looking at is relationships. And the title that the book gave to these 3 chapters, if you notice at the top of page 39, is Seeking Love, Test of True Friendship. So, of brothers and friends, when we think of friendship and we think about the Bible, what friendship tends to stick out as an example of deep and enduring friendship? David and Jonathan is what we always think of. There's a good reason for that, and I want to talk a little bit about David and Jonathan this morning before we get into the text that we'll be looking at. We have recorded for us in 1 Samuel chapter 18 some verses about this, and let me actually go there. I didn't mark this ahead of time, but 1 Samuel 18, I think it's worth just taking a minute to read a few verses here. And in the context of the story of David, 1 Samuel 18 is immediately after he has defeated Goliath. And there's kind of an interview process after he's killed Goliath with King Saul. And they're really not sure who this young man is. And so Saul is just questioning David in the end of chapter 17. Verse 18, now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit on the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. It's an interesting start to a friendship. We don't have any real information if there was any kind of knowledge of David and Jonathan of each other up to this point. But something about what had happened, the way the Bible describes it is that Jonathan's soul was knit to David. How do we express that today? I mean, we don't talk that way. What is being conveyed here? 2 peas in a pod would be a good way we might say that, right? Okay. Besties, says Ricardo. All right. What happened here? How is it that they so quickly were bonded together? There's something there that there was a kindredship, right? And David had just demonstrated what? Through the killing of Goliath.
His bravery, his love for his people, and his love for God.
Okay, yeah, the love for God is what really, or dependence on God, his confidence in God. And to hear David talk about that afterwards seems to have struck Jonathan, and I think it's because Jonathan had the same mindset. So sometimes this friendship between people can happen quickly if we read this as it's recorded here. And it says, Jonathan's soul was knit to David, and Jonathan loved David as himself. And those are traits, this loving someone as yourself is what we associate with a deep friendship. But Jonathan was in a very difficult situation. What was the situation that Jonathan's in that makes his friendship with David so difficult? Son of Saul. Okay, how does that? That's true. Why does this make this difficult? What was that? Okay, Jonathan was the heir to the throne. But yeah, so Saul initially loves David, but very quickly the jealousy turns to hate. And so Jonathan is in a situation where he's loyal to his father. His father is the anointed king. Jonathan is in line to be king. And yet David is also God's anointed to be the next king. David is demonstrating all the traits that Jonathan loves and respects. Is it really true that Jonathan was in line for the king, or is that just speculation? Well, Saul himself will get so angry at Jonathan at one point where he will tell Jonathan, and this is recorded for us, Jonathan, you don't understand. As long as David is alive, you are never going to be the king. So the implication here is, yes, Jonathan was to be the king. At least that's what Saul is promising. So that's a very real conflict in the mind of Jonathan. For most of us, given the opportunity to be king, we might tend to maybe be disloyal to our friend. Does Jonathan? Oh, Intia?
I think that Jonathan really didn't even care much about being king because he would have rather had David be king. And his loyalty was more towards his friend David because of what he stood for than his own father.
Okay. Mark?
What?
You're wanting to say something.
We're just cut short. We don't get to know Jonathan as much as we would have liked. He was an outstanding friend.
Right.
Everybody needs a Jonathan in their life.
That's true. And not everyone, sadly, has that. But can we ourselves better prepare ourselves to be a Jonathan to others? And I think Proverbs, these chapters this morning, will help us. Raul?
The irony is that even in the Bible, and in reality in life, loving is a hard thing. I think that brothership has to do something with love.
Okay.
We can pull more examples of, even up to the scriptures, of brothers who comes into conflict than those who demonstrated the love that Jonathan had. So that has been something, some other element at work that has nothing to do. Be so different. No wonder there's so much written about Christ himself. So much work to be done. It's almost an impossible task for us to love each other because we're so different. And yet, we're expected to love each other.
Exactly.
Or John, book of John, whatever, First Peter chapter 12, whatever. We are expected to love each other. And so, it's work. And it has to be that element that will cause us to love each other without, not withstanding the differences, that is going to move us to love like God wants us to love.
That's true, and you're getting a little bit ahead of me on some of those ideas, but let's go back to that, and we'll visit just a second longer about Jonathan. Did Jonathan, in the situation he was in, did he ever mislead David? There's no evidence of that. Did he ever let David down? Okay, no evidence of that. Did he ever forget about David? Do we see any envy from Jonathan towards David? Did he put his interest in front of David's? I don't see it. Raul, were you thinking of something else? Did Jonathan ever put his interest in front of David? It seems like his interest was God's interest, and for that reason, he put David above himself. Okay, very good. That's what I was trying to build on. So all that being said, that's a relationship we have between David and Jonathan. What about, let's take a step back, because we're talking about friends and brothers here, and there's a contrast, a comparison being made. What were David's brothers like? Do we know a whole lot about David's brothers? Not a whole lot. There's some information. There's an interesting exchange with David and his oldest brother. What's that? Eliab, yeah. And so in 1 Samuel 17:28, David was sent to check on his brothers. Jesse sent young David to the battle to check on his brothers. That was the assignment. David arrives, and Goliath is making this challenge to God's people. And David is just, he has to know, what's going on here? Who is this guy? Why isn't anyone doing anything? And the exchange between David's oldest brother and David is recorded. And, well, here, let me read that too, since I've got it open. If I can read with these contacts. 1 Samuel 17:28. Now Eliab, the oldest brother, heard what he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle." Okay, so his response to David being there is to scold him, and he assigns some bad motives to David. He calls them wicked or evil. There's some ill will here for sure. David's response gives us a little bit more information about their relationship here. But David said, What have I done now? Was it not just a question? And you can hear this between brothers, especially a younger brother. What now? What did I do? I didn't do anything. And really, David hadn't. He was doing what he was supposed to have done, according to his father. But it kind of reveals, perhaps, a typical relationship between an older brother and a younger brother, and some animosity, some rivalry. How does David respond? He totally ignores his brother's rebuke. And, just all that talk about how David was wicked and evil, he just puts it aside, doesn't let it bother him. Didn't carry a lot of weight, it seems like. And David, of course, remains. He had other brothers. What is David's position in this family? He is the youngest brother. And when Samuel comes to Jesse to anoint the new king, it doesn't say, and I don't want to speculate too much, it doesn't say that Jesse immediately knows who the one is. Jesse doesn't say, "Oh yeah, I know why you're here. My youngest son David, I'll go get him." Jesse proceeds to kind of introduce all the sons, before David. And when they got to the end of the boys who were at home at that time, it's not as if Jesse immediately knows what's going on. It doesn't occur to Jesse, seemingly, that David is the one. So it doesn't seem like there was anything obvious about David amongst his brothers physically. In fact, what God says to Samuel in this moment is that man looks at the outward appearance, but God looks at the heart. And that brings us all back to the lesson today in Proverbs, in the verses that we have read. It's about the heart. And it reminds me, this relationship between David and his brothers, we don't have a lot of information, but this situation reminds me a little bit about the 12 sons of Jacob. right? What was the relationship between the youngest son in that family and the older brothers?
There was jealousy in there.
Jealousy, animosity, so severe that ultimately what happens to Joseph?
They sold him.
Yeah, they had talked themselves into killing him, and in the end they compromise and they just sell him into slavery. Okay, so is there a closeness among brothers, or is there not a closeness among brothers? How does the situation with Joseph resolve? Is it ever resolved between Joseph and his brothers? It is. How is it resolved? How do they recover from this situation? Joseph had to forgive, and it was a very difficult thing, I'm sure. And we see the passages, and it's not just once, but a couple times he has to have this conversation with his brothers, right? And it was a lot of care shown by Joseph. There was a lot of love that was demonstrated. There was, even through what had happened, still an incredible bond among brothers. And that's what we see probably in our own experiences, that there is a bond among brothers that is, it's hard to rival, right? When we see in Proverbs 18:24, finally getting back into the text, a man of many friends comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. That's supposed to be impactful. That's supposed to make us think. There are friends that are closer than an actual brother. That's what we're supposed to be impacted by. And so, to have a relationship like David and Jonathan, to have a relationship where we have friends closer than family, there are some things that we have to do. Our heart has to be prepared for these relationships. And so these chapters have so much in them about how the heart needs to be prepared for these relationships. And so that's why we're going to look at that this morning. But this book was not written by David. It was written by Solomon. Do you think it's possible that David ever told Solomon about Jonathan?
Yes.
Okay, it's speculation, but I can't see how David could have raised a son without talking about his friend Jonathan, right? And so it may be that as Solomon records these verses, he's thinking precisely of Jonathan. We don't know that. But what were Solomon's brothers like? Competitive, bloodthirsty, rivals. Solomon didn't have brothers in the sense that we would associate with a loving family. We know that from Scripture. And so it seems to me that likely his appreciation for friendship and brotherly love comes from what his father shared with him, and not necessarily what he saw in his own life. Okay. So all that being said, we have a simple outline on the screen that we'll use this morning. And I want to start in chapter 17 to kind of set our minds for this discussion when it comes to the right heart we have for our friends. And we'll start in verse 9. Proverbs 17, verse 9. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. What kind of situation would there be that requires you to cover a transgression? Is that a real thing in the lives of friends? What's being conveyed here? Are we covering up for a crime?
It's forgiveness.
Okay. It has to do with forgiveness, right? And why would it be important? And we look at the contrast here. But he who repeats a matter separates intimate friends. To get a little bit of a clue of what's being discussed when we're covering a transgression. Nikki?
You're forgiving someone something that had wronged you for the sake of your friendship. and you don't keep bringing it up, every time something goes wrong, you say, well, remember when you did, you don't do that. You
Okay.
forget it and move on.
Forgive and forget, right? Okay.
It could be something to do with fidelity to confidentiality. You're faithful to your friends. You're faithful to one of the things. You won't be malicious against the person. So confidentiality, person you can trustworthy. I get that idea.
Yeah.
That same expression, separates close friends, is used in chapter 16, verse 28. Maybe that, I think it's more in line with what Raul's saying, that, friends tell each other things, and when you repeat what they say, you're going to mess up your friendship.
Right. The confidentiality is the way he.
Confidentiality.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay. And so the underlining attitude here is love, right? And love will allow you to do that when maybe if you're motivated by rivalry or envy, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. What's the difference between in this context, brotherhood and friendship?
Well, I mean, we're talking about friendship here, and the brotherhood is just a way of conveying the some of the attitudes we have towards our friend. Brotherly love is not about a family relationship. It's about how we treat people as if they are that close to us, that important to us. Right? So I think what we're seeing in all these verses, it's about relationships we have with anybody we come in contact with. It doesn't have to be family. Does that answer your question, Raul? Maybe. Okay. All right. So many verses, so many chapters. I'm probably going to have to start picking and choosing here as we go. Verse 3 in chapter 17 is something for discussion as we start this conversation. The refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests hearts. Have we seen this type of language before in our Bible studies? Yeah, it occurs in multiple places. Sometimes, like 1 Peter chapter 1, he talks about our faith is tested by fire. In this case, our hearts are tested by fire. And what's being conveyed with this comparison between silver and gold?
They do melt away. Even though they can be refined into their most purest parts, they can also be destroyed.
Well,
Our hearts can too, but it's the pureness of our hearts too that God sees.
the pureness, I think, is really what's key here. I mean, as we look at a lump of silver or gold, and it may appear pure, but when you put it through the fire, you may discover there are impurities that weren't previously visible. And the fire is what refines and demonstrates true purity. And that's how we achieve purity. And so with hearts, that's the same concept. It's through adversity that our true heart will be revealed. And it's through adversity that our friendships will truly be revealed. Glenn?
I think we forget that sometimes in life. I've had a lot of people say in my company, when something bad happens, why is God letting this happen to me? Well, maybe he's testing you. Maybe he's trying to help you gain those better qualities that are in you, but that need a trial like that to bring them out.
Okay. Good. Anybody else? We saw verse 9 already. Let's look at verse 17 in chapter 17. If I can stand close enough or far enough from this text. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. So tying us back to testing hearts. And again, brother and friend is used interchangeably, but a brother is born for adversity. If you have a true friend, if you're thinking of somebody right now who's a true friend, it's probably has something to do with how you were able to go through adversity and whatever assistance they were able to provide. That's where friends are cemented with us, through adversity. And so David and Jonathan, obviously, they had adversity their entire relationship. And that true friendship demonstrated itself over and over again. So if we want to be a true friend, we need to be there through adversity for our brothers. And if we want people to be there for us, we have to have that heart of service and love. Okay, other verses, because we're going to have to move, other verses in chapter 17 that we didn't discuss that you wanted to bring up. There's so many interesting verses here. Maybe if we have time tonight, we'll go to it. Chapter 18, as on the screen, tried to focus on the self-centered conversation as a reproach for character. So there's a lot of verses in here about how we speak. And we saw that in the previous lesson, but this is more about self-promotion in these verses, or that's one of the themes we find in chapter 18. So for example, verse 2 of chapter 18, a fool does not delight in understanding, but only in revealing his own mind. Do you know somebody who just loves to hear themselves talk? Is it usually somebody who's got the best wisdom to share? Not usually. Usually the one who loves to talk doesn't necessarily have the best contribution to the situation. We need to be aware of our own tongues as we read these verses. If we have something to share, then we need to be bold enough to share it. But we also don't want to just talk because the opportunity is in front of us to hear ourselves speak. Ricardo?
The two words are in this, which is the ability to listen and understand so that you can carry on a valid conversation. But sometimes better than talking is just listening. I think that'll show more of a desire for a relationship. If you just keep your mouth shut and listen to what another person has to say.
Yeah, and it's through listening that we're better able then to learn and to contribute and truly be a benefit to those around us. There's some really great verses we'll get to in a second here on just that, on the importance of listening. Verse 4, we're keeping moving here. The words of a man's mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a babbling brook. What's being said here? What's the contrast?
You said babbling brook?
That's what mine says, babbling brook.
Mine has bubbling.
Bubbling, okay. Not really different though, right?
No, bubbling, it's constant, in constant motion. I think wisdom can be in constant motion, and what I'm seeing. And if the words from the man are deep waters, it almost has no bottom, I guess. It's flowing.
Flowing. Is that what yours says, Reuben? Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. But the deep waters may be stagnant, you know. And so
Difficult to fathom.
true wisdom is accessible, and it doesn't have to be through deep, long, endless conversations. It can be just right there, and the value is more than those deep waters from the mouth of a man.
It's called not beating around the bush.
Okay?
Straight to the middle.
Let's do verses 13, and we'll go all the way through 17 on this one, and we're still in chapter 18. He who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. That's to Ricardo's point. The spirit of a man can endure his sickness, but a broken spirit who can bear? The mind of the prudent acquire knowledge, and the ear of the wise seek knowledge. A man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men. The first to plead his case seems just until another comes and examines him. Okay, so a few things there. The importance of listening, right? Ricardo made that point. We have to be the type of people who are able to listen if we're going to be able to be wise. And then 17 really strikes me. The first to plead his case seems just until another comes and examines him. We've probably seen this in our own life. Someone has come to us with a problem or a situation, and as they explain it, we're totally on board with them. We think they're in the right. We think the problem is someone else has done something horrible to them, and we leave that conversation with our minds made up. Sometimes, when the full situation is revealed, we have a very different understanding. And if we had acted based on the information that was partial, then we would have acted foolishly. So do we have the understanding, have the wisdom to know that? And when we are confronted with a situation, are we patient enough? Are we wise enough to seek out the whole story? Y'all experienced this, I know, Antia, but have y'all experienced that in your own life where you jumped right in thinking you had the full story and later had to backtrack because you did not at all get this right? Antia?
I think that has to do a lot with our own maturity. When we're younger, we wouldn't do things like that. We would just jump head on in, because that's our friend a lot of times too, or it sounds right. But as we get older and we mature and start to understand how things go, then we start to, we'll listen, we'll hear it, but then we will seek out to see what the other side is. And which to me, that sounds like verse 15, where the mind of the prudent acquires knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks the knowledge.
Right.
So I think that's what, it depends on our age and our maturity.
But it's not always age, right? I mean, sometimes someone can be more aged and still make these foolish mistakes. Reuben?
I mean, it's a defense mechanism there. Have you ever been part of a jury? You get selected to be a jury. Before you become the jury, you get put through all this mess of questions and answers, and they pick the ones that have absolutely no bias, allegedly,
Okay.
for whatever the case may be. Which is interesting.
Which is important, right? I mean, if they're selecting jurors who have a preconceived notion, then justice won't be served. Okay, very good. Glenn?
I thought the jury thing too for these verses, but a little bit differently. Having sat on a jury a few times, the first side in court who presents their case,
Mhm.
it always seems like, well, okay, they've stated it pretty clearly and they seem to be in the right.
Right.
Until the other side gets up.
Right.
And it sometimes changes.
That's right. Rob?
I can tell you, my oldest sister, she died last year, but she can, if I'm in a dispute with somebody else, and I take a story to her, she don't believe me.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter who you tell.
Right.
And the same thing, it depends on your relationship with her.
Sure.
I'm saying this, my kids, they can do something, I can be the same way and say, okay, I believe you. But I've learned, and I think we have to learn certain things. Even against pride, I need to test to see what's going on. I related this for authority. You're going to rush to judgment, and then you're going to find yourself in trouble. And
Right.
so there's no shortage of advice when it comes to the New Testament, all deal with matters. But we have to learn. We don't have the tendency, the first thing we hear, we run with it. And that's natural. But wisdom teaches us that we need to examine.
Right.
Listen, if you're concerned, I have this one principle when it comes to things that you hear. If I can't do anything about it, don't tell me. And don't come telling me to keep it to myself because it's a secret. I have a wife. I got children, I got people I consider friends. I'm gonna tell them. Don't tell me anything you don't want to hear. And don't come asking me if you don't intend to help solve
Okay.
if there's an issue. And so with that principle, it even guides me. I'm not gonna go find what happened, unless I'm prepared to do something with it. But we need to be careful and examine things as issues and see how we can help if there's a problem to solve. Listen to both sides.
That's a great point, and brings up some verses that are in the text today that if I could see better, I would try to find them. But we shouldn't be listening to the quarrelsome person who comes to us just to tell us, yeah, this is what happened to me. We have to be wise enough to not listen to some people because we can get involved in situations where we don't belong, or we can just be listening to scandalous information,
I don't want to. We had a problem in Boys Night with this brother, some rumors around. Nobody wants to go to him. And, I didn't know about it. And eventually I got brought up here about it. And she was all upset. You need to do so. I said, but this. I called the brother, hey, you have some time? Yeah, I got some time. I said, look, can you meet me? Yeah, we meet you. And I went to our meeting. I said, this is what she's saying about you. And yeah, she was saying she admitted it. And we got down to the bottom of it and turned out to be nothing. About people are being offended.
Yeah.
Rumors started, what you started, and whatever. And I think those principles work. Not only Christian relationships, it can work in family relationships, it can work in the world, it can work everywhere.
Right. So to summarize chapter 18 before we move on, verse 21, death and life are the power of the tongue, and those who love it will eat its fruit. So in what we speak, there is a lot of power and a lot of responsibility, and being wise is able to control that. Ray?
I was going to say in the previous conversation, in the previous verses, the elders of the congregation are charged with guarding the flock. And if you see someone who comes and is in need, and the elders have talked to them and have determined that this person is in need, that's one thing. If they determine that the person is a shyster, and that happens a lot, and the elders are responsible for that.
Right.
And then some of the congregation says, well, this poor person needs help. Well, the elders have determined and through wise eyes have decided that this person is not available, not eligible for help. Then that's a real tough situation.
Okay. And that's part of exercising that wisdom. Okay. Chapter 19, summarized here, is that fair weather friends will fail us. And so a couple examples of that. Let's do verse 4 first. Wealth adds many friends, but a poor man is separated from his friends. We saw a verse like this previously, and really, the poor man being separated from his friend is not what we should do. It's an observation of how the world works. And you may have a ton of friends, according to this verse, but are they the type of friend that we're trying to become ourselves? It seems from these verses, let's look at verse 6 as well. Many will entreat the favor of a generous man, and every man is a friend to him who gives gifts. Okay, so are these true friends? What's the motivation for the people in these verses to the rich man?
Want something.
Yeah, they all want something. And do we see this in our own experiences? Probably we all have, right? So just because we have a friend, we don't know without the adversity whether or not these are true friends. And we have to make sure that we're not living our lives pursuing people who can do us favors. Verse 15, still in chapter 19. Okay, and this is going to bring us to a whole nother set of verses, and there's quite a few other things going on in verse 19 about other matters aside from the fair weather friends. Maybe I'll just pick a few here. We have about 5 minutes left. Let's go to verse 14 instead. Unrelated topic. House and wealth are an inheritance from fathers, but a prudent wife is from the Lord. Okay, so we may set up for our children all kinds of physical blessings. And in the case of Saul, for example, may have wanted Jonathan to have power and prestige. People who are in positions of power can set up trust funds, opportunities for their kids to be prosperous, but can they provide that child with an appropriate wife or husband? How does that happen? How does a husband get the wife most suited for his spiritual development? It's a gift from God. Okay. The opposite is true, not the opposite, but the correlation. A wife finding a truly beneficial husband. It's a gift from God. It's something you can't do for your children. God is gonna have a part in that. What can the young man do to find a prudent wife? Does he have any role he could play?
Be prudent also.
Yeah, he needs to be wise as well, right? Looking at the knowledge shared in Proverbs is a great place for a young man or a young lady to look as they start making that decision. But there's no way for a father to buy a prudent wife. It's a gift from the Lord. And men would do well to remember, if you're blessed enough to have that, that is a true blessing, and it's something that money can't buy. Thoughts on that?
You can look at this a whole different way too. The inheritance is usually from the father to the son. Is the son as prudent in handling money as the father were? And I'm thinking, maybe that's a reason why we can find a prudent wife to handle the money that we can.
Okay. One more verse before we close. Let's look at verse 18. Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death. Okay, what's another verse, famous verse, that we looked at last week along these same lines? Yeah.
We looked at the one, do not spare the rod.
Right, don't spare the rod. Could you despise your child by doing that? Discipline is important for parents. It's a very difficult thing to do. And some of the versions of this and other verses we find are very descriptive and almost refer to the child calling out, begging for mercy, and the father has to discipline anyway. The wisdom to discipline is something that we have to acquire. We know we have to. How do we do it well? It's one of the things that a parent struggles with. Is it important? It's absolutely important. We can't neglect it, no matter how much we'd like to just ignore all the things that our children do that are inappropriate.
Not necessarily physical.
Right.
Discipline should be handled by a man or a woman with children in light of raising them correctly to begin with, and steering them and providing information that's helpful to them. And if they don't do what they're supposed to, then you beat them.
Okay. All right. This is one of the most difficult things a parent has to do, and yet it's It's critical. So, okay, so tonight we'll pick up in lesson 11, which is Proverbs 20 through 23. Thank you very much.